Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be taking a look at the MIDI Modifiers MIDI insert effect. So this is only available if you've got Cubase Pro or Cubase Artist. I'm not sure how far back in terms of version numbers that applies, but certainly that's the case now, which we can actually see if we take a look at the feature comparison. So this is one of those things where I think it's worth looking. Often, I don't know which version of Cubase everything comes in, and often I have to refer to this. So this is actually a useful page to look at if you're not sure if your version of Cubase has something, because often people will be like, well, I don't know whether or not that applies. That's the case here. It's not the handiest because it's not always searchable. I think if things are hidden, you can't really find them. So it's one of those pages which looks nice. But as we can see, it shows that all of these effects are available. All of the MIDI effects are available in Cubase Pro, but also in Cubase Artist, but they're not in any of the lower versions. So that's just one of those things, I'm afraid. So you may not be sure where it appears, but on a MIDI track or on an instrument track as used here, it's in the MIDI insert section. If you don't see the MIDI insert section, just click the little cog here and then make sure it's ticked there. You can see there's other things that I've not got turned on at the moment. Now, MIDI Modifiers is actually available as its own section, so it is available here. But the reason I'm using it as a MIDI insert effect is it allows you to record it to the track. So if you set something up, you can turn on record, as we'll see in a second, and then you can record it into the track as you play live, which can be useful. So you just pick it up by clicking in the first slot, as I've done here, and go to MIDI Modifiers, and then you'll see this whole section will appear. There's a slightly weird bug which is happening in Cubase at the moment, which is it keeps turning the status line back on. Bye-bye, status line. So this is the MIDI modifier section. Now, don't be intimidated by all of these things you see here. We're going to go through all of these in this video. Some of them are pretty simple, some of them less so, but they're all useful. This is actually one of those boring but useful tools which I find interesting. So the first thing we have is Transpose. So this is pretty straightforward. So we're just going to obviously just play something back. So here's just a little MIDI part here, and we can just transpose this straight away. So if we put it on 2, you can hear it's changing. And we can go crazy with the transpose. So you can see, you can go, yeah, 127. Certainly not lacking in capacity for transposition. So you can go to any amount you want. If you click on here, you get this sort of old school looking like Cubase SX3 slider appears, or you can double click and put the value in. So let's put that back. Velocity shift works in much the same way. So this just adds or subtracts a fixed amount to and from the velocity. So if we open this part up, we can see that these are around 70 and around 27. And if I play this back and then start adding it in, you'll hear this change. And obviously with MIDI, maybe not obviously, depending on whether or not you know how MIDI works, once you reach 127, that's the limit. So with these, we're already at the limit. They're already flat out. We can go down, obviously, so we can remove those as well. Now, with this part here, I've specifically picked this. So these are around 30, etc. So these high notes are at low velocity. So if we turn them down enough, so if we make them sort of minus, let's say minus 40, we will lose them. So you can see, well, those notes are there. They're not playing because the velocity is now 0. And another bit of MIDI nerdery, a note on with a velocity of 0 is actually a note off for technical reasons, which we won't get into here. So the next sections are the compression. So you've got velocity compression and length compression. So we're going to look at velocity compression here. Now, this may not make sense initially because when you see compression, you think of compression as in audio compression with a threshold and a ratio. And in many cases, it's one of those things which is quite complicated to understand initially. Certainly, I remember compression was something, it took me quite a few runs at it to get my head around it and understand what was going on. So if you're finding the word compression, a bit intimidating, don't worry about it, because in this case, it's actually multiplication. So all it's doing is it's multiplying this by a certain value, which does lead to compression because of the limit of 127 or 0. But we can multiply these up. Now, with any of this, if you're not sure what it's doing to what's happening, we've got a quick aside here, which is in the next slot. What I would say is to pick MIDI monitor. So I'm going to do that on this track here. And yet again, the status line reappears. Bye, status line. Thanks. So this is the MIDI monitor. Now, again, this can look moderately intimidating because there's lots of stuff here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's on always on top so it doesn't disappear every time I start changing some settings over here. And then I'm going to turn off everything except notes. So when this starts playing back, we will see the note information. So you can see these notes here. And the column I'm interested in is value 2. So value 1 is the pitch of a note, and value 2 is the velocity. So that's how hard the key has been hit. So we're going to just play this back, and we will see these notes appear as we play this. So we can see these coming through, and you can see the velocities are 70 and 30, which is useful. And then it comes through. So let's just try our compression of 150. And what we see is now it's going between 45 and 105 because 30 times 1.5 is 45 and 70 times 1.5 is 105. So it's actually made the gap between them bigger, even though they've increased, because previously the gap between them was 40 and now it's 60, etc. So it's not really compression, it's expansion. It's multiplication anyway. This is one of those terms which I always found confusing, and it was only when I looked into the numbers that I realized what it was actually doing. So if we put this up to 200, then what's going to happen is our louder notes are now hitting the limit of 127 and the quieter notes are now 60, etc. If we wanted to make them all the same, we could just put in like 1,000. And now everything's at 127. We can go the other way. So we could go like 50%. And now we can see there 35 and 15. So I'm not sure how useful this is. It's one of those things where I think I've used it a few times, but it's certainly not something I use a lot. But you might find it useful. You might find particularly it's useful if you've got some live playing, which needs to be calmed down a bit. And maybe with a combination of shift and compression, you can do something with it. But I'm going to put that back to 100. That may not be so useful, but the length compression in air quotes, is more so. So we're going to look at that next. So here we are on another track. It's the same MIDI information, but it's on a sound which actually plays back the length of notes. So if I just put the on-screen keyboard on, if I play a short note, you'll hear it short. And if I play a long note, it's long, unlike the kalimba sound I was using earlier on for the previous one. So if I play this back, you already know the music. You get the idea. The length compression just multiplies the length. So again, if we want the notes twice as long, we want them half the length. Let's make them 25%. There we go. So we can get them nice and short. There's some interesting things happening with the sound at that length, but there we go. Yeah, so that's really useful because, again, you can make these edits really quickly and it doesn't matter. Obviously, in this case, we've got a toy part. These are toy examples just to show you what's happening. You can do this on, an hour-long track in one move. You don't have to open it up in the editor and play around with it and then find out you've made an edit that doesn't work, etc. So it's really good. Even if you're just roughing these out to decide whether or not you want to do this, you can do that pretty quickly, as you've seen, and then maybe you can apply it by one way or another, but it's certainly something which is useful. We will look at how you can apply this to MIDI you've already got at the end of the video, because that's also a useful skill with this. But next, we're going to look at randomness. So if you've read my sequencing section in my book, you will know that I am a fan of randomness. The reason is we are humans, well, most of us are anyway, and when we play things, we never do them exactly the same anytime. Even if you take the most skillful players, and I've been fortunate enough to record some incredibly skillful and talented keyboard players, you can hear there are tiny variations in what they do each time. So I've actually done this with some of these talented people and recorded the MIDI data of their performance. And you can see there are small variations in what they do every time. It's not always the same. They are consistent in terms of the overall pattern of what they're doing. But if they play the same note 10 times, it will be slightly different. It won't be as different as when I do it, but it will be different. So this is one of the elements of humanity which we want to put in. Now, if you've got a part where it is completely the same all the way through. So here I've got, again, that same part, but now all the velocities are the same, as you can see on screen. If we want to introduce some randomness to it, there are ways to do it. Now, you can do this in the logical editor. There's a series which I did previously, but the logical editor is a bit intimidating for people, and this is an easier way to do the same thing. So we've got the random section. So this is here, and we can do two things at once if you want to go that way. We've got a few targets. So this is much more straightforward than the logical editor. So let's just look at velocity. And then you can add and subtract a certain value. So this is good because it's relative. It takes the original data and it just adds or subtracts a certain amount. So if we go, let's say -7 and +7 on that, and then play this back, you can hear, hopefully, it's just a bit more varied, even though, yeah, so occasionally it will do something unmusical, so it might accent a note which you maybe don't want accented, but again, at the end of the video, we'll look at a way to effectively print this down to a MIDI part, and then you can do any editing you want, so you'll have fixed randomness, as it were. So this is a really easy way to add this nice and quickly. So next, let's take a look at length. So again, we can change those values. So let's make it. So we can see here, we need bigger numbers to make a difference. But again, we're adding some randomness in there. So if you want to make it sound a little bit less sequenced and a little bit more human, and add in some micro variations, which maybe won't be as noticeable as that, but will add to the effect of it sounding as if it was played rather than you just copied a 4-bar loop for the next 10 minutes. That's a very quick way to do that. Now let's look at pitch. So random pitch. So there are two main applications for this for me. So I'm going to show you the more musical one first. Now, what I've got here is a snare which has been put into Halion. It's just a fairly mundane 808 snare drum sound. You get the idea there. And the part is just going to play it in 16ths. So it's just fairly mundane. Now, the problem with that is it sounds pretty repetitive because it's the same thing over and over again. There's no variation in there. Now, what we can do is we can introduce some randomness in there, but not change the pitch in the way you may be expecting. By default, the key follow would be set to 100. And what that means is that when you change an octave, let's get it right, shall we? That would be nice. When you change an octave on your keyboard, that sample follows that. So an octave's change on the keyboard means an octave's change in sound. Now, if you want to make things sound a bit more varied, you can reduce that. So this is one of those things which I don't think the sampler track does, but key follow is pretty common in most samplers. So here we are in Halion. So this isn't Halion Sonic. This is Hallian, so don't look for this if you don't have Hallian Sonic. This is one of those things where I think the naming is maybe confusing people at the moment. So we're going to reduce this to about 8%. So if I change an octave on the keyboard now, you can hear it's not changing that much. I would need to change 8 octaves, which I don't even have access to get an octave's worth of sound change. So I'd need to be on C11 for this to go up by an octave. So that means we have much less change. So now if I introduce some randomness into the pitch here, so let's say we're going to go -12 and 12. So these will be random. It will be playing it over an octave, but we won't hear an octave's worth of difference. So let's just have a listen to that. So that's probably too much, but we could maybe just change this here. So maybe the key follow would just be 3, so it'll be much less of a change. So there's just those tiny little variations in there, and that's enough for it to not sound as repetitive as it did. So that's one application of random pitch. Now the other one is probably going to be more straightforward. So here we are, and we've got, this time, I've just loaded up a sound on trip. So I've got a citrus tree. It sounds like this. So we're just going to get these initial notes because they're going to be very short. And again, I've got those 12 plus and minus 12. And this time, if I play this back, I'm actually getting a musical effect in this case because this is going off the bottom of where Citrus Tree will react in any reasonable time. Okay, so if we loaded up a different sound, so let's load up Bit Liquids. I think that's what I had on earlier on. And then just play that back again. You know, you can quickly get some weird randomness, etc. If you do this just on a plain old sort of beeping sound, you get that, the sound that the 1970s thought the future was going to sound like kind of sound. So you can get quite a variation via lots of different means there. So I'd just leave you to play around with that, but random pitch can be really useful for, say, for those random kind of sounds. Next, we're going to have a look at range, which is the next section in MIDI modifiers. So the range section allows you to select what will pass through effectively in terms of pitches and velocities. So again, this is similar to what the logical editor does, and the nice side of it is that it's much more straightforward. I've just got these random things in here just to make this sound a bit more musical, because otherwise it's getting a bit tedious with it being so rigid. So we've got velocity limit and velocity filter, note limit, note filter. So we're going to look at velocity filter first. And the first thing you probably notice when you turn this on, if you don't change any of the settings, yeah, you get nothing. This is one of those cases where the default settings are a bit annoying. So change your maximum to 127, and then it will let everything through. So it's no longer filtering because the minimum allowed through is 1 and the maximum allowed through is 127. So then it will just play it back as it did before. Now, if we open this part up, we can see the low notes are about 30. I think they're consistently 30, and the high velocity notes are about 70. So if we set the minimum to 45, it will only let the louder notes through. And if we do it the other way around, so if we set the minimum to 1 and the maximum to 45, it would only let the quiet notes through. You can see those sort of offbeaty kind of things are the only ones that are coming through. So that's the filter in terms of velocity. Now, in terms of limiting, this works, again, in a useful way. But the default's not friendly. So just set that to 127, because then it will just not limit everything. So you can set your minimum limit for what's going to get through, or your maximum limit. If we set our minimum limit to 45, anything below 45, you can hear, hopefully, that's now louder than it was. So it was effectively on 30. So they are quieter. Now, if we set this to 70, what happens is those quiet notes, so if we look in here, any of these here as they go through the filter, because their velocity is 30, is getting bumped up to the minimum value, which in this case is 70. So now these will be consistently at 70. And there you go. So they are now playing through. Now, obviously, I've got some randomness set up here, but you can get the idea. I could take this out. Let's take that out. That'd be a good idea. So it's going to be a bit more boring, but it will be, everything will be flat. So that's the velocity limit. Now, the pitch limit, note limit, and note filter. These are also useful, but actually I'm going to demonstrate this on drums. So here we've got a drum track. Yeah, you can hear where I nicked that from. Bonus points for anybody who knows where the drum part and the kalimba came from. Now, often you may have multiple drum tracks, or you may want to split your tracks across multiple instruments and then say, I only want to have, let's say, the bass drum and the snare drum on one particular track and everything else on another one. That is a job I would normally do with a logical editor, or you can do it manually, but manually is A, painful, and B, error prone, and those are not good things. Neither of those are desirable qualities. So what you can do is look in here. So we've got here, bass drum is on C1 and our side stick is on C sharp 1, and then above that we've got our E. But let's say we just want to have from C1 here up to E1 here with the snare, and then the rest of it we don't want to play on this particular track. We can do that really easily with this. So we go to note filter, and then we're going to set it to C1 for our low note. It won't let me do that because we need to set the maximum first. So we're going to just set that first, and then C1 here. So now these are set between C1 and E1, and we can hear we're just getting those parts coming through. So even though we've got all this other stuff here, so we've got all these other notes, you can see when I play them on the keyboard on screen, they don't get through because they don't pass through the filter. Obviously on our other track, let's say we were going to have another track, we would set our minimum to E1 and our maximum to, let's say, C7, and then we get all the other bits. So it's really easy to split these, and you can set your split point, etc. So nice, easy way to do that if you want to filter those or just play certain parts on certain drums. So say the filter is really useful, and obviously you've got your note limit. That is less useful, I think, but it works in the same way as the velocity limit does. So if anything's below a given value, then it will move it up. But obviously with pitches, that can get a bit strange. There may be a use for it. I can think of a few, but not straightforward to demonstrate straight away. But you get the idea. So next, we're going to have a quick look at the delay section. So here we've got our two drum tracks set up, split between the two, and we can delay one of them. So this is typically useful either where you want something to happen early. So you may have seen a tip in the past where you can set your delay to a negative value in the inspector. So in fact, let's just go and look at that. So you would set it here. This is a delay in milliseconds, but you can do exactly the same thing here. So let's just set this to 50, which is the limit. We can see that this is typically useful for things where you've got a delay in sound propagation, etc., or you need to delay it in terms of musicality. But problem is with 50 milliseconds, there isn't really that much you can do. That's only a very short note space. But you may find if you've got old MIDI equipment, particularly, I remember I had a sequential drum machine, ironically, which was actually a bit late all the time. So you'd set it to, minus 12, etc., and then that would play it early, that kind of thing. But you can find musical uses for these small things. You can just push part of the kit, etc., that kind of thing. So I've heard worse drummers than that. I definitely play drums worse than that, but that's the delay. Finally, in terms of sections on here, we're going to take a look at scale. So the scale section will be familiar to anybody who's looked at the Scale Assistant, and this is sort of proto Scale Assistant territory. So it's pretty useful. It's probably slightly less involved than the Scale Assistant. So here we've got a major scale. which is fairly straightforward. It's in the key of C for reasons of simplicity. So you can just apply a scale here. So there is a whole selection, some of which are popping off the bottom of the screen, and you can even set up new ones, etc. So let's just set this to harmonic minor. Now, the sound of music is no longer the sound of music in this case. So you can hear we've got that harmonic kind of minor sound. We can set it to blues, which won't work as well for reasons. Actually, I take that back. That's not so bad on that. Pentatonic will probably double some notes. Yeah. It must do because there's only 5 notes in a pentatonic, hence its name. And it has to fit those 7 notes of the major scale to there. So there's a whole load you can go through here. So you can get some new harmonic and melodic ideas by playing a melody in and maybe changing it through this. Let's go back to harmonic minor and then change the key. So this doesn't transpose this as such. All it does is it fits it to a different harmonic minor scale. So if we fit it to D harmonic minor, we get a different result again. So I think actually it's a bit like playing a mode of that scale to a degree. So you've got some experimentation room here. Obviously you've got your keys only mapped out as sharps. It doesn't do flats, etc. But this, say, is very similar to the scale assistant, which you find here. The scale assistant has got more use and also applies things to the display on screen, etc., and can do more in terms of snapping your editing and so on. But this is like the granddad of the scale assistant here. So that's all the sections of the MIDI modifiers plugin. Now, there are 2 more things to look at. Firstly, presets. So these are really useful. So you can click here. There's not an enormous number of them, but you might find that they are a good starting point. So for instance, the pitch range one, it just sets this to note limit between C1 and C5, etc. More and less velocity, etc. Filter notes with velocity below 20, etc. Those kind of things. So if you're a bit stuck, maybe look at a preset. You get most of the idea here. It's certainly not a huge range of presets, and I would think, hopefully, having watched this video, you'll know what you want to do, but the presets are reasonably useful. The other thing which is important is actually fixing these events into MIDI parts so that you can use them. So if you're playing live through this, if you hold down the record button, as you record this, when you record the track, it will get recorded. So this effectively moves this to the track getting recorded. This is something I've mentioned in a previous video. So if you were going to play something in live, these would apply, which would be useful. But they don't apply to something on here. So if you mistakenly decided to hit record, you can see the part we're getting, it's not re-recording that. It's not passing this back through this effect and then doing that. So that doesn't work. But what does work is a different tool. So what you want to do is firstly, make sure the track you're talking about is soloed. So we're going to solo just random pitch. You may or may not know if you hold down Command or Control when you click solo. So let's say you've got a bunch of other tracks soloed. Normally, if you hit solo, it will just add that to the solo list, as it were. If you hold down the Command or Control key as you hit it, this then just becomes the only thing that's soloed. So you see those other ones got turned off. So that's useful. Secondly, set your locators with the king of all shortcuts, P. So now we've got it set around there. Once you've done those 2 steps, you're only a step away from being able to see the randomness applied. So you go to MIDI and then go to Merge MIDI and Loop. A new window will appear. Just make sure Include Inserts is ticked. We don't want any of the rest, but this is the default, so you should be okay, and then you click OK. And what happens on top of that is the merge of the MIDI that's in the loop. Now, if you don't have it soloed, you get the MIDI from all these tracks, which may be what you want. It's not what you want right now, but that sits on top of that. So we're just going to get rid of the original. And then now we can see the effects of our randomness, which in this case was pitch. So you can see those have all been applied, and then you can edit these to suit, you can pick a particular random one that you like and this, that, and the other. But that's the final tool that you need in your toolkit if you're going to use MIDI modifiers effectively, because obviously if you're dealing with randomness, it's different every time, hence being random. And you may not like the randomness you get each time, and there may be a particular one, and you want to burn it down to a track to edit it further, etc. So that's an in-depth look at MIDI modifiers, which, despite having been present in Cubase for a long, long time, is actually still a really useful tool for getting utilitarian MIDI editing tasks and also some compositional and creative things done. And as I've already said, it's less intimidating than the logical editor, which is more powerful, but that power comes at a price, which is it's much more complicated and much less friendly. So MIDI modifiers is kind of logical editor light. As ever, hope you found this video useful. If you have, like, subscribe, chat, all that stuff before our robot chat-based overlords take us over and I'm replaced by a simple script. And hopefully we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.